tuning in for this webinar on how buyer enablement can help drive commercial growth. My name is Charlotte and I work as a consultant here at Quadrant Consulting, and I've worked within B2B sales and marketing for the last decade or so. So I've previously hosted a webinar on how to make marketing materials that work for sales. And we touched upon how many sales reps actually don't use the marketing materials that are developed because they find them irrelevant, hard to use, or simply not fit to their buyers' needs. Following that webinar, I actually got quite a lot of follow-up questions on which assets of the recommended assets I would prioritize in developing. And that sort of led me to think which of these assets we should actually prioritize in creating. So we went back to some of our clients who have developed quite a big range of these buyer enablement assets and asked for their thoughts, perspectives on which asset they really got the most results from or the highest yield from. And they all had a quite similar answer, which was the buyer guide. And that's what we will look into a little bit deeper today. So thanks for joining. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll first of all cover how buyer enablement assets are a game changer in the B2B market, and then dive into some of the common pitfalls to actually avoid when you're developing these assets. Next, we'll then tune into what is a buyer guide and what content and tools to include in creating it. And then we'll end off the session with a Q&A. So please feel free to provide any questions or ask any questions as we go along. We'll then cover them in the end. So starting off, why are buyer enablement assets a game changer in the B2B market? You've probably heard once or twice before that the buying journey is often described as very difficult or complex by a lot of B2B customers. In a world with huge selections of both products and vendors available and increasing complexity inside organizations, basically buyers are having difficulty finding and assessing the solution that really fits their need and maybe even actually narrowing in their problems to begin with. One of the reasons for this is that in a modern B2B reality, more people are involved in the buying journey or the buying process, and which also means that more information sources are used along the journey. I think most research says that it differs from research to research, but on average, 6 to 10 people are actually part of the buying committee in a B2B organization today. That means that multiple stakeholders are sitting around the table and they are all using different information sources and channels to pile in information and make the assessment of either the problem or product or solution available, or the vendor also offering it. It's said that buyers use more and more digital channels, and they're actually becoming channel agnostic compared to using sales reps or engaging with the actual vendor prior to completing the sales. So what that means is that buyers are already 60 to 70% through their decision-making journey when engaging with your business. I don't think to many of you that this is news, but it's actually quite critical to consider when we are developing assets and what assets we are developing in trying to engage our buyers. Because then what happens is that buyer enablement has sort of become this golden standard for supporting customers along the journey. Buyer enablement can take many forms. It can be many different or include much different information. But with buyer enablement, the core philosophy is that revenue teams or commercial teams, they actually work together and focus on how to make the buying journey easier to navigate and sort of ease the decision-making process. It can include anything from ebooks to calculators to infographics, but that's not really what we're here to discuss today. It plays a really pivotal role in the modern buying process by catering more to self-service preferences of the modern buyer, and really also maybe leading more to a personalized or at least a more relevant experience when consuming content. So buyer enablement is sort of moving away from producing more generic content to content that's tailored to either industry or specific companies. And what we'll focus on for the next few sections is what to avoid when you're actually developing these assets, so some of the common pitfalls. First of all, what we see is that a lot of teams, even in their journey to create more buyer enablement assets, is that they're taking an unstructured approach to content production. So I have a background from the agency side, and I've been tasked with creating various materials for many, many years. And I really can't say how many times I've been tasked with creating awareness assets or a white paper. So they sort of come on this ad hoc basis, either because someone had a great idea in the team, or simply because it's the next KPI they're trying to meet. So being KPI driven or product driven rather than being having a clear structured plan for how to develop the content. The result of such an approach is actually that you end up with this disparate and confusing content. So buyers are out there searching across your channels, and what we call the scenario that the corporate website actually often becomes this asset graveyard. So everything is uploaded to the website. Marketing teams may not think a lot about it, but the buyer will go in, search for PDFs, and get all of this confusing or actually duplicate information that's simply wrapped in new ways. That way, the buyer is certainly not getting help along the journey. It's actually making it more complex to sit down and assess the vendor together with the buying committee. So one of the first pitfalls is really taking this unstructured approach to content production. Very much in line with this is that a lot of companies still take an outside in the product, not the audience. So they do recognize what kind of information that the audience needs, but it's all very much centered on the product, not the need. So it's sort of a camouflage actually pitch around the or taking outside in the product, highlighting all the benefits that it provides to help solve a certain problem, but not really being focused on the need or the problem or the root cause that the buyer is experiencing. And really taking a customer-centric or buyer-centric focus, it means that your content is all about the customer. So before diving into solution mode, you're really focused on helping them establish the need, search for the right solution, and also identify what kind of requirements they would need to assess their product on. And the latter is really crucial in trying to secure interest and engagement when your buyers are out researching independently. And the last thing, or the last pitfall, is simply pretending that competitors don't exist. I think it's quite a big lie, or at least a blindfold in marketing, that if we don't talk about our competitors, our buyers won't find out that they exist. So as mentioned, buyers are already quite far in the journey, and Bain and Google actually did a study where they asked buyers if they already had a certain list of vendors prepared when they actually engaged. And 80 to 90% of all buyers actually already have a set of vendors in mind before they even start the journey, which means that they are not in this complete explorative phase and mesmerized by all the awareness assets that we are out there creating. They're actually already sort of certain what two competitors or alternatives to compare. Knowing that your potential customers already know about your competitor, you can actually stop being so reactive and not mentioning them up front, but instead attack it head on and start comparing. It feels definitely uncomfortable. It might be out of the comfort zone, but it actually just helps the buyer gather the information and assess on the right requirements. So you can steer the conversation rather than sitting back and being reactive and hoping that your buyer won't find out because they already know. And basically, that leads us to what would be the right thing to do. And to sort of counter what I just said, the first thing is be proactive. Provide the buyers with all the information that will help them steer and navigate their journey and their buying committee. So again, navigating these different kind of stakeholders who may have conflicting interests actually requires that someone takes the lead and helps guide the way. And buyers do compare solutions to alternatives, but may feel overwhelmed by the benefits offered, which leaves an opening really for those who dare to be proactive. And if your solution, isn't the right fit for the buyer, I'm sure that you will still establish some kind of credibility and trust in that buyer, meaning that they maybe will return when their needs are different, or when maybe when they need something completely else, where they remember the great advice. And honestly, do you really want buyers to buy your product if it's not the right fit for them? Probably not, because then the post-purchase phase and everything from implementation to optimization will probably go wrong, and instead you'll end up with a customer who's not really satisfied. So really being proactive and being honest about what kind of problems you solve. Next, act as a trusted advisor. I think it again ties very much to the former point, but really being this lighthouse for your buyers in showing them the way, and demonstrate your strengths and weaknesses to help them make the right choice. It will be very valued. And lastly, cater to the full journey. And this is honestly, it's a big task, but don't think too much about a funnel, creating awareness, creating engagement, and so on, but think about the journey and what obstacles and barriers there may be along the journey. Don't wrap product information in new ways, but really think about what kind of information your buyers need, and support them with that for different purposes. And as I said, developing assets to cater the full journey is no easy task, and it requires quite a lot of resources in developing and maintaining and optimizing, and it also forges the need for collaboration across revenue teams, being marketing and sales. Without that collaboration, really, you don't get the proper feedback on what works and what doesn't work, and you might end up with these two silo teams that are not really working together, and the assets are not being used. So on this slide here, I put a lot of examples of how to support the buying journey. And again, if you're sort of losing your breath a little bit and thinking, I don't know where to start, that's also what came out of the last webinar, saying this is quite a lot. So in the very beginning, we're talking about blog posts, social media posts, your website really being able to create awareness and interest with the buyers and helping them identify their problems. As we move in or along the journey, what we really see buyers needing is more reports, infographics, white papers, sort of these long form content that really helps them understand their need better, the need for the right solution, and also start establishing requirements. And lastly, when we're into the more supplier or vendor selection phase, we really need some demos and some tools that can help them make the right decision. And this is also very, very much of the comparing different vendors are going on. So rather than starting from scratch or doing this ad hoc where you just throw them out one by one, in these fragmented and sort of incoherent pieces, there's actually one asset that sort of ties everything together and can make sure that everything makes ends meet. And that's the buyer guide. So one of the most important but often quite overlooked assets is actually the buyer guide, but I believe it should be any marketer's central starting point. And that's what we will cover for the next section. So what is a buyer guide and what content and materials to include in it? Let's try to do a story. So imagine that you're an IT solution architect and you're tasked with finding a way to manage your master data or your product information. So basically, you're in the need for a PIM system or an MDM system or something like that. You start doing some research, you Google, you browse different websites, and you're actually quite overwhelmed with all the findings from different vendors and all the benefits, and basically vendors promising to do everything for any need that you may have. As valuable then that you think that a one-to-one demo would be, you simply don't have the time to sit through 5 vendors and going through 1-hour demos or on-demand demos and really understanding what all of these different benefits are and how they compare. So what if there was an option to really consolidate all of that information and compare the solution? So someone who compares the solution for you, so you don't have to take time doing that yourself. And that's where buyer guides come in. A buyer's guide is something that can be placed either digitally or physically in front of the buyer and really help them facilitate and drive the buying process and discuss the common challenges, the solutions out there, the industry needs, and then provide some of these information on the vendors that are out there and really help the buyer make the right decision. So we can sort of think of a buyer guide as a pamphlet on steroids. So not being about the product, but about everything that the buyer can even think of. It's really a deep dive into the entire solution landscape. So not just from your subjective perspective, of course, your product is better than competitors, but it's really a deep dive into the entire landscape. And it's also an opportunity to show your worth. And I wanted to before going too much into detail with how you actually make all of these things come alive, then use an example from one of our clients who did this. Secomea is a software company, a software as a service company who sells remote asset management. And they really saw a need to help the buyers. So many solutions out there and a super complex product that actually needed some, you can say, holding hands through the buying process. So they recognized that buyers were having difficulty in really driving this forward. They created a buyer guide, and the results have kind of amazed everyone that was involved in the process, because it actually turns out that it was one of the highest performing lead generation assets in the company, providing more than 250 leads since launch. They also used it for retargeting. So if someone went on the website and left, let's say, a high intent page like a solution page, they actually used the buyer guide to retarget these leads, or not leads, but interested people, and get them back into the website and maybe actually download and become a lead or a contact in the system. They also used the entire buyer guide to bite size and fuel their content engine. So actually chopping it up in different pieces and using it along the way for the content engine, making sure that it's actually a quite structured approach to marketing. So not just asset by asset, but really knowing that all information ties together and conveys the same story. They also included some of the parts for actual sales presentations when the sales reps were having meetings, or the sellers actually used it for a sales follow-up. So if the salesperson had a great meeting, they could thank the buyer for taking time and then say, actually, to help you further along the way, now that we've had this great meeting, here's our buyer guide to make sure that you make the right decision. That's actually quite impressive for the salesperson to have that sort of, or establish that kind of credibility with the buyer. And the most amazing things, when I come from a world where I see a lot of marketing materials not being used by sales, this was actually widely accepted. They really like it, and they like to use it for different interactions, and new SDRs are onboarded when they join the company. They are tasked to read the buyer guide to make sure that they know everything about the buyer's reality. So it's not being pushed down the throat of the sales reps. It's actually being accepted and acknowledged and widely used. So really a critical asset along the buying journey and helping everything from marketing to sales reps. So really, what kind of materials, contents, and tools should be included in a buyer guide? If we use the methodology that's called they ask, you answer. It's sort of a business framework or a philosophy that has one obsession at its very core. And it's, what kind of questions would my prospect have? Answering questions is the best way to try to navigate the buying journey. So not just providing information out of the blue, but really thinking, what kind of question could my buyer have in this particular phase of the journey? And we can use that philosophy in answering what kind of content we need to include in our buyer's guide. And the time-tested, most frequently asked questions includes the one on the screen here. So what challenges do you solve, being very high level? What are the strengths and weaknesses of your product? So if I have a very, very specific requirement, do you meet that requirement, or do I need to balance it out with something else or go with a different vendor? what are the different vendors out there, what are the alternatives, and how do they compare. How much should I be willing to invest is also very helpful in guiding or steering the buying committee. So what should I go for a bigger budget, and then what would my return on investment be? So really helping sort of also set the cost framework or the investment framework around the solution. And what factors influence the price? Because maybe some of the factors, if we have these modular pricing settings or models, what factors should I prioritize? And do I really need that? And I have some information to go back to the buying committee and discuss with. And then who should I involve? Setting up the buying committee. Do I need some more technical people or commercial people? If I'm an IT solution architect, how do I make sure that my company really benefits from this investment? So basically, we can group these together and say anything about challenges, root causes, and solutions. It's about the buying process, and it's about costs or investments. It's about alternatives and comparisons. So stepping away from this ostrich marketing, pulling your head out of the sand and being willing to compare. Of course, there's different ways to compare. We'll get back to that. And then reviews and testimonials. Can I learn from someone else out there? Considering then all the pitfalls and these examples of topics you should address, let's get a little bit more specific in some examples of what to include. So never create a buyer's guide without a qualifying checklist. Specify, clearly state who is this guide for. Don't go broad because it basically goes against the point. If you have tailor your buyer guides for different users, different professionals, different functions, or create separate versions, making sure that you actually talk right into the need or the problem of the specific users. So make it a targeted buyer guide. Help them build the internal story for change. So set up the buying process and a how-to. Detail who should be involved and how to drive the buying process forward, even maybe tackling some of the obstacles that the buyer may experience. And then, of course, deep dive into the industry challenges and root causes. So become a thought leader and really demonstrate your knowledge of the industry, not just on the challenge level, but also on the root causes that may be driving this challenge, and really make it easy for them to recognize themselves in the problem. Next up, establish requirements and specifications. So turn the problems into requirements and help your buyer actually establish what they need. So don't just list the requirements that your own product fulfill, but basically tie requirements directly to the challenge or the root cause, and then you can use that for a comparison later. Because comparison charts or vendor assessment tools are really, really helpful. So either tackle your competition head on and compare products to products across the industry, or if that feels a little bit uncomfortable or too direct, maybe you are actually friendly with your competitor, what do I know? Then provide guidelines and tools for how to assess vendors. So instead of doing it directly, provide the right guidelines and say, here's a comparison chart. What you do is you put the requirement and you rank and sort of so on and so on. So create an example instead, provide a template. Which leads to the last thing here, help them drive the business case for change. So include tools and assets and resources that goes beyond being simply all your great information and knowledge on paper, but it can include a business case template. So what should you consider? How much would it cost? How is the prospecting or what do I get out of my investment? And so on and so on. Include or develop return on investment calculators or TCO calculators, really for the buyer to understand what will this mean when I invest in this certain company. So take one step ahead and don't let the buyer assess because maybe their calculations are wrong or they're considering the wrong parameters. So instead be this guiding lighthouse helping your buyer decide. And lastly, if needed, maybe help them create a checklist for RFPs. If they need to go out and request proposals from different vendors, help them ensure that they ask for the right thing so you know exactly what they're bidding on. That's some of the sort of high level or some of the pieces that could be included in a buyer guide, but I hope you really get the gist that this is more on taking a step back and being objective in the market, really becoming this guiding lighthouse for the buyer, helping them steer the buying process and even setting up the buying committee and so on and so on. So ultimately, a buyer's guide is actually relevant for much more than helping buyers buy. So maybe you already got it from when I went through the example, but first of all, it's great for lead generation. It really is a high value asset, and it also is quite time consuming, of course, to develop, because you need some different people and a lot of time to really make sure that you develop it the right way. But the buyers will definitely also see it as high value content, and it can be used for lead generation as was seen with Secomea. It's also great for sales enablement. So really elements of the guide can be used directly for sales meetings or sales presentations, or as a follow-up afterwards. Then it's also great for employee onboarding. So it's not just a tool that can be buyer relevant, it's also great when someone new is joining the company and can really quickly get up to speed with the entire landscape, even the competitive solutions and the core benefits of your product. So see it as an onboarding guide, really from a buyer's perspective, not from your own perspective. And of course, very important, it can be used for content marketing. So not just for lead generation, but for anything, basically. You can really chop up a buyer guide and fuel your content engine with it. And if we just stay there a little bit, bite-sizing it into different channel-specific formats and writing blog posts. So say that you have a specific challenge or theme or something worth mentioning, you can chop that up and write a blog post. So if someone is out there Googling who caters to this challenge, or what should I consider in this industry, you will also rank from a digital perspective. You can create webinar series. I'm here talking, it's not based on a buyer guide, but you could actually take the information from the buyer guide and do webinars for those who want to learn more or listen rather than read. You can also do newsletters, again, similar to the blog post. Fuel it with newsletters to your existing database. Maybe some are previous customers, maybe some have never bought anything, but really stimulating and showing your worth. And then, of course, for social media. I would say it's from a buyer guide, you can get tens to hundreds of social media posts ready for your content marketing engine for the next year or so. So basically, best practices for developing a buyer's guide. Remember, reject the temptation to create a camouflage pitch for your product. It's tempting, I know, but stay true to being this trusted advisor who stays as objective as possible. Do involve different stakeholders from your organization and do it in a bimodal way. So start out explorative and then narrow it in and get them back in for validation. So include them to really identify critical points and topics, but then close the doors a little bit before opening it up for validation. Don't go for text only. Really include these tools and templates that the buyer can actually use to drive forward the buying process. Text is great. It's a lot of information. It's a lot of words, but tools and templates are really what moves the needle when we look at how it works for some of our clients. Include external experts to really establish this credibility, and also they can help actually release the distribution or amplify the distribution afterwards. So if you have an expert in the field, he'll probably also be proud to share it with his network, and so on. The amplification goes. Spend money on time and design. I think this is actually a quite critical point. Maybe don't over-invest. It's not a multi-million-dollar asset that you're creating, but do spend time on making it look nice, use images, use models, and so on to help the reader actually grasp all the information. And lastly, bite-size it. Make sure that you use it not just as one piece of content, but also for distribution across channels. And maybe even consider turning it into a book or a pamphlet on steroids, so you can provide it to senior leaders who never get any snail mail and would maybe actually enjoy sitting at home with a cup of coffee and reading something physically. So do consider actually going beyond digital. So all in all, don't forget, a buyer guide should really be relevant to the specific buyer and their challenges, whether it's a vertical or on company level or whatever it might be. It should be quick, easy, and convenient to access and use. So don't overcomplicate it. Make sure that your buyers can actually access this and have it as this high value asset. It should be useful and applicable. Again, back to the tools, ensuring that you go beyond text only, and do support with credible data and facts when fueling it in, so it doesn't become this subjective blah blah, but you actually have something to build credibility of what you're saying. I think that was it. Let's go to the Q&A, or today we'll call it you ask, I answer, to stay with the philosophy that I mentioned earlier. Yes, for sure. Do you see any major differences across verticals in terms of buyer behavior? Is software more complex than, say, car leasing? Yes, I would, of course, say that there's differences, but I would actually also say that a buyer guide can help regardless. It's just being very true to what kind of industry you're in. Historically, actually, software companies have taken B2B marketing a little bit more serious, and maybe that's also why we're here standing with an example from that kind of industry, because it is more complex and should be implemented, and is quite also investment heavy. But still, I think for other industries, it's very much applicable. Car leasing, I'm actually in the market to lease a car, and I don't even know where to begin or what to consider and how to narrow in my needs. So it's different, but it's still applicable. That's it. Well, thanks everyone for tuning in, and I hope you have a great day. And yeah.